Sunbelt Syndicate.
What's going on, Sunbelt fans? My name is Dominic Cressetto, the host of the Sunbelt Syndicate podcast, where we review the week that was and look forward to the week ahead in Sunbelt football, basketball, and baseball all year long. Please follow us on all social platforms, including YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and also note our Patreon account for those of you interested a little further in more Sunbelt action. This will be the last wrap-up for the baseball season, the Belt Baseball Beginner, as I've called it all season long. Really my first foray into really closely following Sunbelt baseball, not just my favorite team. And so it was a very interesting season, a very good season overall for the Sunbelt. We'll go over a little bit of that and let you know that we will be providing football coverage throughout the summer. So now that baseball is officially over, LSU did take down Florida 2-1 in the College World Series, officially becoming national champions. You can hate that all you want. I know I do. I can't stand LSU myself, just from personal experience while I was down there. Didn't really care for Florida much either. Nobody really in the SEC would I have loved, but it is what it is. They are crowned champions, and now we can kind of recap the baseball season as a whole, maybe a little bit better because of what we know now. As far as the standings go, we'll kind of go over them. I know that we've touched on that in prior episodes, but now that we have a full look on how people finished up the season, I think we can retouch that and maybe revisit some of those things. And also it'll include all the postseason matchups as well, not just the regular season before Sunbelt tournament action started. So I've got the groups laid out, but before we get into team specifics, I also want to talk about how we fared versus the other conferences. So we'll start out with the SEC. Obviously, no matter who would have won the College World Series, it would have come from the SEC as they were the last two teams standing. The Sun Belt had a 5-16 overall record versus the SEC, so not necessarily a great showing there. I know that a lot of our teams reside in the SEC part of the country, so there were enough matchups to really get a good tell on where those teams stood. We did have Louisiana take down LSU as the LSU Tigers were number one at the time, so a very impressive victory in the end there, but overall record, obviously 5-16 is nothing to be very proud about or be hanging any hats on. So the surprising part, though, is that we actually had a worse record versus the ACC. Now, we played a pretty good amount of teams from the ACC, and not just the amount, but I guess I should say the teams that we did play from the ACC were pretty quality opponents. You've got, UNC, NC State, obviously Wake Forest this year. Duke was very good. So they had some top quality teams, and maybe that's part of that 4-18 record. But, obviously a worse winning percentage versus the ACC than we even had versus the SEC. And neither of those conferences provided many series, really. It's just kind of mostly one-off games. Sometimes you spaced out 2 games apiece among those teams and a week or two in between those matchups for whatever reason. Against the Big 12, we'll move on to them next. A 4-7 overall record. Not great, but not terrible, really. I mean, you're closing in on that 500 mark. Certainly better than the SEC and ACC. And Big 12 is throughout, those of you that listen through the season is really the conference I thought Sunbelt matched up the best with and could be argued to be better than as far as kind of those Big 5 conferences are concerned. Speaking of the Big 5, we've got 2 left, but the Pac-12 didn't provide us any matchups unless I somehow missed one, but I don't think I did. We did not have any games versus the Pac-12. That's not surprising with where the Pac-12 is located, obviously. Not really very many teams in our geographic region, so no surprise there. But we did play quite a few teams from the Big Ten. In fact, we played more teams from the Big Ten than we played from the Big 12. From the Big Ten, we had a 5-12 overall record, which surprised me because when I looked at the Big Ten, I didn't think they were very comparable as far as powerful teams or great conference records for their individual teams. So I thought we'd have a much better record versus those teams. And if you note maybe why we played so many more of those teams than, Big 12 opponents. It's likely because a lot of the Big 10 country is in snow and winter climates, and at the early part of the season, they are looking to come south to get some games in because playing up at home just isn't as easy for them. So this is a big mark. I've noted it before in the podcast, but that is a big opportunity for the Sun Belt every year to try and schedule some of those opponents, get them out of those colder climates and get into some Sun Belt, literally Sun Belt schools for the conference, but also just general Sun Belt teams as well, and get them some games and some reps before they get into their conference play. So that's one that I think we'll probably see continue going forward and hopefully can improve quite a bit upon. I know, the shocking one to me early season was Illinois coming down to Southern Miss and taking that series victory from the Golden Eagles, unfortunately. And the Illini didn't even end up really at the top of their conference. So that one was a little bit of a surprise. Again, hopefully going forward, that one can improve. Now, we'll get to the better marks as we get into these last four. These are not the last four conferences that we played, but these are the ones I thought were more important and to make note of because either people think they're pretty much on par with where the Sun Belt is, or they've had some teams that have been pretty good in the past and kind of show us how we stack up against them. So, first off, Conference USA. Obviously, we've had some detractors from Conference USA move over to the Sun Belt. This one was probably the biggest important one to really win for the season in my mind. We did do that. It was a 14-6 overall record, so probably one of the most impressive records as far as like-minded or thought to be roughly similar opponents versus a whole conference with Conference USA. So I'd say very impressive mark there to finish with 14-6 record versus CUSA. Then we will jump into the American. American, not necessarily the greatest baseball conference, but they do have some good teams, probably most notably the ECU Pirates, which quite a few teams matched up with this season. We had the conference win there again, if you will, 13-9 overall record versus the American. So a little closer than Conference USA, but again, still a winning record. Not overly impressive, I guess, but still impressed. You come away with the wins victory there, as some of our not as great teams also won some of those games against American competition. As far as the Big South goes, we played a ton of teams from the Big South. Probably, again, they just match up well. They're close regional games, so easy to schedule those types of opponents, and they've got some really quality opponents there as well. Again, most notably, I can't stop saying noticeably, but most notably, probably the Campbell Camels being the top team there, although UNCW also had a great run this year as well. But we did still win the season series with that conference, going 16-12 overall. So we didn't win it by a great margin, but with that many games, and again, the array of teams that are matching up, 16-12, I think is overall a great record to go against the Big South with some of the good teams they have at the top of that conference. And we'll round it out with the last conference I kind of made the matchup with was the SoCon, the Southern Conference. Again, somewhat similar to the Big South, a little bit less notable teams really overall, but in the geographic footprint of the Sun Belt, pretty good. We went 11-2 versus those teams, so obviously the biggest winning percentage there. And then again, we had tons of other conferences that we played a few teams from. But again, those are the ones I really wanted to note before we jump in to the big breakdown of the Sun Belt itself. Again, baseball standings, unlike football, they aren't going to have an East-West. This is 1 through 14, straight through, no East-West split here, easy to decipher where everyone stands without having to worry about cross-regions or cross-division matchups here. So I've grouped them into three groupings. Your first five to be the strongest, pretty obviously. Your next five, kind of middle of the pack, and then I've got our last four. To me, those were all really where the separations lied. You've got Coastal Carolina, Southern Miss, Troy, Louisiana, and Texas State in that top five. Very easily to see why I had that. All of those teams had good overall records for this season as well as making the postseason for NCAA. So that was pretty obvious, pretty easy to see there. In the next 5 grouping, you've got App State, James Madison, Georgia State, Georgia Southern, and ODU to round that out. Most of those teams flirting with or right at 500 for their conference record, and either right around 500 or just above, just over a little bit for their overall record. The one outlier there being ODU with a 32-23 overall record. They did lose their first game of the season and then went on a big tear to win a bunch in a row. We will touch on that in a minute. But they ended up this season kind of alternating between wins and losses. Just couldn't string together a lot of wins to really get them to the postseason. I know they had the thought process or hope that they would after a good season last year without really making it into the tournament, and they were hoping to do so this year. But I think they found just how strong of a conference in baseball the Sun Belt really has become now, and just couldn't quite put it all together with the consistency there at the end of the season. Now we'll get into the last 4. Again, these are the obvious groupings, and this one's probably the biggest gap between them. I think South Alabama, Arkansas State, ULM, and Marshall all being below 500, not only in conference, but also in overall season standings. Easy to see why they are down there kind of by themselves in that last 4 pair of grouping. Now, individually, I want to touch on a couple of things. We're going to note the longest win streak, the longest losing streak, as well as what teams thought might be their biggest single victory, as well as their biggest series victory. I think this is kind of interesting to see because sometimes you don't realize some of these teams have beaten somebody as big as they have or taken a series from somebody that was very much better than them, and you kind of forget some of those things. We'll also maybe look at how some of these teams finish the season, what a little bit of an outlook is for next season going into the 2024 baseball season. We will start at the bottom with Marshall. I've got their best win 7-5 over App State. Again, maybe they had some victories that might be considered higher in the RPI or whatnot. I don't know if they did. I didn't go that deep into this, but just as a basic look, I got that 7-5 victory over App State being their biggest. I've got their best series victory over St. Louis, 3-0 sweep, and that one started the season, and I think that's why I kind of landed on that one more than anything else. Even if they had won some other series, you start the season 3-0, it doesn't really matter who you beat or how weak the competition may be. That's a good start to the season, probably brings your confidence up. Obviously, we know now that didn't do a whole lot for Marshall overall, but probably had the fan base pretty happy to start the season, winning all 3 games in a row there. They did win 3 games in a row 3 times this year. However, they did lose 14 straight. That is how they ended the season. So for that reason, I'm going to say their outlook going into next season is not great. I think the biggest plus they have going for them is hopefully their new stadium is finished so that they can play a true home game going into next year, and hopefully that can provide them at least a handful of more victories than they had this season. Jumping up into the 13th spot, we've got ULM going 17-37 overall for the season. That was pretty much a one-game betterment than where Marshall was at with a 16-36 overall record. So for ULM, I've got their biggest victory being an 11-5 victory over Mississippi State. So kind of one of those teams that I was just kind of alluding to. You don't realize that they had some big victories. Mississippi State didn't perform all that well overall this year, to be honest with you, but they play in the SEC, and that's a large reason why they didn't have a great record overall. So for ULM to beat them 11-5, still a very impressive victory, especially for a team in this conference that was towards the bottom. I think a lot of people would say that easily is their biggest victory this past season. As far as their series is concerned, they did get a 2-game sweep, if you will, since the last game was canceled over App State. I think that's kind of their biggest series victory. They also looked pretty impressive in those 2 victories and probably had a great shot to get the full 3-game sweep had it not been canceled due to some weather. So I'm going to consider that their biggest victory there. As far as win streaks are concerned, they did have a 4-game win streak at one point this season. They also notably had a 6-game losing streak. So not too high or low on either end. Obviously, 6 losses in a row, not great, but you'll see that some of the other teams well above them in the standings still lost 6 in a row and still had good seasons. So what they need to focus on is stringing more of those wins together. I'm obviously stating the obvious with that comment, but that's a part where you got to string together a little bit more than 4 victories in a row at some point to start doing that more repeatedly, and maybe at least some 3-game sets strung together a little more often than that they had this past season. So jumping into the 12th spot, we've got the Arkansas State Red Wolves, finished with a 20-31 overall record. Going to state that their largest single victory was a 5-4 win over conference foe Texas State. They also had a 3-0 series sweep over South Alabama. Now, they may have had some other series victories, but I'm going to consider that one the biggest because they ended the season with it. So it's going to help them going into next season. I don't think those things like carry over necessarily, but the thought and feeling when you end the season with a 3-game sweep is definitely a good one to have for your individual players to thoughts of content to go in to sticking with the program or believing that maybe next season they can kind of turn it around. So I don't know if all that will happen, but it can't hurt to win a 3-game sweep to end the year like that. They did win 3 games 4 times this season for their longest win streak. So not the longest of streaks themselves, but to do it 4 times, not too bad. The problem is they did at one point lose 8 straight. So that is one of the issues. It's one of the longer losing streaks in the conference and one of the reasons why they ended up towards the bottom. Number 11 spot, we've got the South Alabama Jaguars. They finished with a 23-31 overall record. Single biggest victory, likely the 12-11 victory over Louisiana. Their series victory that I consider to be the biggest, a 2-1 series victory over the Troy Trojans. Obviously, Troy ended up towards the top of the conference, so I think that one, especially with how those teams really don't like each other. Hate, maybe the best word to describe that one. So I think winning a series over Troy and with how good Troy was is their most impressive series victory. They, just like Arkansas State, did win 3 games 4 times throughout the season as well. However, they did lose 10 straight, and those 10 straight were their last 10. So much like Marshall, really not a whole lot of promise going into next season. Something that the Jags will probably struggle with. And hopefully they can start to turn some things around because as far as kind of tradition and history go, South Alabama is usually one of the better Sun Belt teams. So we'll see if they can start to turn it around. Maybe in 2 to 3 years they really turn it around and can get back to more of what people think of as the traditional South Alabama quality baseball program, but I don't see it happening within 1 year. So I think it'll be hard for them to jump out of this bottom grouping. Jumping up into that next grouping, we've got ODU finishing at number 10 in the Sun Belt with a 32-23 overall record. Single biggest victory, likely the 8-5 win over Coastal Carolina. Their single biggest series victory, I'm going to consider it the 2-1 victory over Georgia Southern. Now, Georgia Southern didn't finish much above them in the standings. In fact, there are 1 spot above them in the standings. So that tells you where ODU's downfall kind of came. I think late in the season they started to play a little bit more of the tougher, more quality opponents, and that's when they saw the strength of the Sun Belt. And so I'm considering their biggest series there against Georgia Southern simply because they needed to have it at that point to try and keep the season going, but down the stretch they didn't beat a lot of the other teams that probably would have been considered bigger series victories. As far as their longest win streak goes, though, as we mentioned earlier, 12-game win streak after losing their first game of the season. They went on a 12-straight run. Very impressive there, and really only lost 4 in a row at any one point in time. So not too bad, and that's where you see that 32-23 overall record. That's what's also going to show you that maybe they didn't play the toughest of opponents, however, and that didn't get them ready to play in that tough Sun Belt Conference and ended up just 15-15 overall in the conference standings as well. So right at 500 there. And then we'll jump into number 9. As mentioned, Georgia Southern just above them. Losing record overall at 27-29 after what looked like it could have been a promising year. As far as their single biggest victory, a 7-5 win over Coastal Carolina. Again, you'll note that a lot of teams' biggest victory is over a conference foe in Coastal Carolina, and that is because they spent much of the season ranked. And so very impressive victories for some of our teams to try and take them down and be kind of that powerhouse, especially coming out of the Sun Belt most years. Their single biggest series victory, I'm going to consider a 2-1 series over Western Kentucky. Again, mainly just like some of the other teams, it was to start the season. So a nice start to the season to get a jump on that. One of the teams that Western Kentucky, not necessarily the greatest, but definitely a quality program, better than I thought once I really looked into their record. So that's why I'm going to consider that the biggest series victory for Georgia Southern from this past year. They did win 4 straight games at one point in time. They did drop 6 straight as well, though. And so when you've got a losing streak, your longest losing streak, bigger than your longest winning streak, obviously not going to do you much favors in that regard. I think Georgia Southern could go one of 2 ways here going into next season. Again, right near that 500 mark, certainly just a handful of changes in personnel or just a little bit of luck can make that go up. In the same regard, you could see them kind of go back down even a little bit. I don't see a massive drop. I'm not sure if they drop into that kind of bottom grouping that I was speaking of earlier. So I would expect them mostly to stay in this middle grouping. Above them is the regional rival, because I'm not sure how either team thinks of each other as the top rival necessarily, although I don't know who you'd consider that to be for Georgia State anyway. But coming in at number 8, Georgia State with a 30-29 overall record. Their biggest single victory, likely the 8-5 victory over Georgia Southern, because it was in the play-in round of the Sun Belt tournament. So again, as mentioned before, you've probably got some victories over some teams that were essentially ranked higher or higher in the RPI, but this one kept Georgia State's season alive, and it was over in-state foe Georgia Southern. So that, for me, is why I would consider that their single biggest victory of the season. They also had a somewhat surprising 3-game series sweep over Troy. Bats were just hot that week, and I think that one was down in Atlanta as well, maybe played a part in a little bit of home field advantage. So Troy dropping 2 series to 2 teams quite a bit lower than them in the standings, but Georgia State being the recent one there that we're going to mention. They also won 5 straight games 2 times throughout this season, so pretty good set of victories in a row. They did, however, lose 6 straight at one point in time. But again, kind of combine those 2 things, see why that's a team that ends up about 500. Jumping up to number 7, we've got James Madison, their first season in the Sun Belt. They finished with a 31-25 overall record. For JMU, considering their biggest victory, 8-3 over Coastal Carolina. And I think their biggest series victory was the 3-0 sweep over Louisiana. Always impressive to beat a Louisiana team. Never easy to do that, and to do it for 3 games in a row. I'm going to consider that JMU's biggest series for the season. At one point in time, they did win 6 straight games, and they dropped 4 straight. So they're a little bit better switching that up from Georgia Southern, who had the exact opposite numbers. But still, again, you see where just a little bit above 500 overall and just a little bit above 500 for their conference standings, as well as they finished 15-13 in the conference. Jumping up to number 6, we had App State finishing with a 30-25 overall record. I consider their single biggest victory a 14-10 win over Troy. That kept them alive in the Sun Belt Conference tournament, where they would go on to face Southern Miss. That Troy game, really a back-and-forth affair overall. They had to come back from behind. A lot of runs was needed by both teams, really. App State comes out on top in the end. Easily to see why that is their single biggest victory of the season. And their series victory that I think is the biggest was a 2-1 series victory over Louisiana down there in Lafayette. Again, just as I mentioned before, never easy to beat that team 3 in a row. Obviously, they didn't, and this one, JMU did. App State did lose the last one, but they had wrapped it up before they went into that final game. And down there in Louisiana, again, never easy, so I'm going to consider that their biggest series victory. They did win 3 games straight 3 times throughout the season, so no really long win streaks to note. They did have a 6-game losing streak at one point in time, and really a bad 6-game losing streak if you look at some of who those losses were to. So just kind of like a lot of the teams in this middle grouping, just a few small changes, and you could see this team either progress or fall back just a little bit. But again, another team I'm going to consider to really be set into this kind of middle grouping. And as we get into the top grouping, we start off with the number 5 finisher from the Sun Belt and in Texas State with a 36-23 overall record, which was good enough to get them into the NCAA regional round. I would consider their biggest victory an 8-4 victory over TCU. Maybe not as big at the time of it happening, but now that we know how far TCU made it in the NCAA tournament, I say they look back and say that was probably their biggest victory. Again, also an in-state school that is thought to be kind of above them, so always great to see those types of victories. As far as series are concerned, I would say their 2-1 series victory over Southern Miss was likely their biggest. They also had a 5-game win streak at one point in time while only dropping 4 straight at one point in time. So overall, again, 36-23 overall record, making the NCAA tournament. Didn't have the greatest of runs in the Sun Belt tournament, however, but again, making it to the regionals, playing good enough throughout the most of the regular season there. Impressive run for them to end up in this top grouping and with a pretty good overall mark for the season. At number 4, Louisiana comes in with a 40-22 overall record. Again, also making it to the regionals, and a lot of people had to think that they had a really good showing in the Sun Belt Conference tournament in order to make the playoffs, and they certainly did do that by getting all the way to the championship game and having a pretty good go at it there, only dropping that one to Southern Miss, the eventual champions, obviously. But as far as their single biggest victory, I'm going to consider that one the pretty obvious one over now national champion LSU, but they did take them down 8-5 there at the box over in Baton Rouge, so that one pretty easily to see that is their biggest victory of the season. As far as their series is concerned, a 3-0 series sweep over the team that finished just behind them in Texas State. That's pretty close matchup really this year with how both teams were. So for them to win 3 straight against them, obviously a pretty good task there. They did win 6 games at one point in time this season and only dropped 3 straight. Now, they did do that 3 times, so that is of note there, but not very long losing streak. And again, goes into that 40-22 overall record, which helped them get into the extra play of the NCAA tournament. At number 3, we had the Troy Trojans finishing with a 39-20 overall record, once again getting them to the NCAA regional round. Their biggest single victory, likely the 8-7 victory over Auburn. Do you see a pattern here where they're all beating their in-state foes? Not necessarily rivals, but the teams you always really want to beat. Luckily, a lot of our teams in the Sun Belt got to do that this year. Their single biggest series victory, I'm considering it a 2-1 series victory over Louisiana at their place. Again, as I had mentioned, not an easy place to go play and win. So to win a series over the Cajuns, I'm putting that as their top series victory. They did win 11 games at one point in the season to their longest win streak, which was the 3rd longest in the conference overall. And they did only lose 4 games at one point in time. So again, a massive win streak, very short losing streak overall. Most of them were shorter than 4 games throughout the rest of the season, only losing 2 or 3 a few times in there. So again, that's going to go into that 39-20 overall record, why they're number 3 in the conference standings. At number 2, we had Southern Miss coming in with a 41-17 overall record. the best record overall in the Sun Belt once you include the postseason run, and they did also get all the way to the NCAA Super Regionals, in fact, being the host there over Tennessee, which unfortunately did end up beating them, but great run there, gotten to host the Super Regionals for a second year in a row. Obviously, last year they were not a part of the Sun Belt, so not too much to say that the Sun Belt team's done it 2 years in a row, but we'll see if we can start a trend here in that right direction. Their single biggest victory, likely a 5-3 victory over Tennessee there in the Super Regionals, as they matched up there and looked pretty good going into the final game or two there in Pete Taylor Park. Unfortunately, they couldn't get the best of the Vols and would not make it all the way to Omaha. But they did beat Dallas Baptist in a 3-game set, so they swept them. And Dallas Baptist, as most know, a ranked team throughout much of the season, very quality opponent, obviously based down there in a baseball-rich part of the country in Texas, so very good quality season sweep over Dallas Baptist there. They also won 14 straight games at one point this season, quite easily becoming the longest win streak in the conference, besting ODU's mark at 12. They lost 3 games only twice all season, so that is their longest losing streak. Again, when you have a good record, end up in the Super Regionals. Keeping those losing streaks short and those winning streaks long is a recipe for success. Now, even though Southern Miss went in as far as any of the Sun Belt teams are concerned, we did have a team above them in the standings for the conference overall, and that would be the number 1 team, Coastal Carolina, who had a 39-19 overall record when it's all said and done. Got all the way to the regional matchups, all the way to the last day of the regionals, but couldn't get by a pesky Duke Blue Devils squad down there in Conway as they hosted there in the regional matchup. Their single biggest victory was a 13-11 victory over Wake Forest. Again, I'm kind of ranking that one that high because of where Wake Forest ended the season, although I think you probably consider that their single biggest victory as soon as it happened as well, with where Wake Forest was throughout much of this season and obviously now when you know how far they went in the NCAA tournament. Their single biggest series victory, I'm considering the 2-1 series victory over Southern Miss, as both teams from the Sun Belt were ranked going into that one, and it was going to see who was kind of the strength of the conference at that point in time of the season. So Coastal had come out on top in that one. As far as win streaks go, they did only win 5 in a row. However, they did that 3 times throughout the season, so not the longest streak by itself, but to win 5 in a row 3 times, still very impressive. And just like Southern Miss below them, their longest losing streak was also only 3 games. And again, just like Southern Miss, they did that only twice throughout the season. So easy to see why those 2 teams ended up right there at the top. Again, for me, going into next season, I really don't see much of these groupings changing. I think it's pretty easy to say Coastal, Southern Miss, Troy, Louisiana, Texas State end up in these top 4 or 5 spots. And again, obviously the order could be a little different, but I think that grouping stays together at least for the next coming season. And I think that middle grouping stays mostly the same, but interesting to see with maybe where Georgia State, Georgia Southern, either one of those teams maybe fall off just a bit, and maybe South Alabama put just enough together, again, with more of just leaning on the history and tradition that the Jaguars have. Can they get out of that bottom 4 and up into that middle grouping and have somebody from that middle grouping fall off enough? It'll be interesting to see. That's really my only real question mark going into next season. But as far as what I would put money on, I'd say most of it's pretty much going to stay the same. I don't see any big drastic changes. So we will see how that ends up. Obviously, baseball now over. We're going to jump full-time into football. Follow along with me, Sunbelt Syndicate, and also follow me over on College Football Dawgs. I've been asked to be a part of the team there. Really looking forward to a lot of the stuff we're doing, a lot of the interaction. There's going to be lots of podcasts. There's going to be lots of articles being written about the Sunbelt specifically, and certainly your favorite teams out there as we get closer to football season. We will be providing more football coverage over the summer. We're not going anywhere. We're not taking long breaks. So we will be around. Please follow along. And thanks for listening to this episode of the Sunbelt Syndicate.
Sunbelt Syndicate.